Welcome to the Bare Marriage Podcast, your place for healthy, evidence-based, biblical advice on marriage. I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire from ToLoveHonorAndVacuum.com, and I am here with my daughter, Rebecca Lindenbach.
Hello.
And we have a lot of fun things to talk about this week. We are starting a new series on the blog, Are We Making Marriage Harder Than It Needs to Be?
Yes.
And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we do that, a couple of weeks ago, we had our Unfiltered podcast where we played a podcast that our patrons get, the people who help support our ministry as we look to get our research published in peer-reviewed journals and
disseminate that research through other social media channels that are harder to monetize.
Exactly. And so we gave you a sneak peek, behind the scenes peek at some of our perks for our patrons, and we just want to say thank you to all the new people who subscribed.
Yes.
And to support us. We're really grateful, and you can do that. We're going to leave the link in the podcast notes for this, so it's not too late to join on. We have a wonderful Facebook group, and we've gotten to know so many people really, really well, and that's been a lot of fun. And we also want to say thank you so much to Covenant Eyes. This month, they are our big supporters for the podcast, and we appreciate them. I am a big believer in Covenant Eyes when it comes to making sure that your internet is safe for your kids, that they can't stumble onto something accidentally. And it's a great first step when you're trying to get over a porn addiction. It does not cure anything. Yeah. It just simply sets the stage so that now you can work on it. And so we have a link to Covenant Eyes. It helps you filter things. It helps with accountability, and you can see that link in the podcast notes as well. Okay, Becca, let's talk about marriage being harder than it needs to be.
Yes.
I have a theory that a lot of modern Christian advice for marriage sounds an awful lot like the Gnostics. And here's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
A lot of Christian advice says things like, marriage is hard.
But it's a sanctifying force.
And you just need to understand that marriage is hard. And the reason marriage is hard is because you have all of these expectations.
Mm-hmm. And if you can let go of those expectations, if you can simply be content regardless of what's happening in your marriage, you'll be closer to God.
Right, because we are to be content in every circumstance.
Yeah.
And that kind of sounds right.
Yeah.
Like Philippians 4 talks about, being content in everything. Paul says in other places that, whether he's been shipwrecked, he's been beaten, and he's found the secret of contentment. And so aren't we supposed to just be content with everything? And yet, I think that whole approach to marriage actually makes marriage harder than it needs to be. And that's what we're looking at in September is, are we making marriage harder than it needs to be?
Yeah, exactly.
It reminds me of like the Gnostics.
Yes.
And do you want to...
Stoicism and Gnosticism are, it's not just reminds of, it's just that we never left it. Right. So there were these branches of philosophy. Stoicism eventually turned into Gnosticism. The overarching similarity is that there's this idea of anything that is virtuous or of the metaphysical world, like the spiritual realm, is good. Mm-hmm. Truth, virtue, God, those kinds of things are good. And anything that is physical is either neutral or outright bad, depending on which school you're in.
And physical could even just be any kind of pleasure.
Yeah,
so wanting pleasure is a bad thing.
Yeah, so like enjoying a really good feast. Mm-hmm. I think the Stoics were kind of like, it's morally neutral, but if you don't do those things and you're able to live without it, you're good.
Ooh, that's real special.
Yeah. So like some of these kinds of philosophical groups would have like their conferences, and yes, conferences were even a thing. Like those little like life coach conferences were a thing as early as like the 200 CE or the AD, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
They'd have these conferences where people would go and they'd spend a week making this gorgeous piece of pottery, and then they'd have to smash it at the end to show how spiritually enlightened they were, that they were able to part with this beautiful thing they had made. Or they'd bring their favorite item, and like the height of spiritual enlightenment by the end of it was to be able to cast it into fire and feel nothing.
Right? And so desire, any kind of desire or yearning for pleasure or yearning for happiness is somehow wrong, and it is better to be beyond that, to be above it, to just simply exist wanting virtue, wanting God. And we see this actually in 1 Corinthians 7, as we talked about a couple of months ago when we were looking at Christian teaching on sex throughout the ages, how Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 was actually talking directly against the Gnostic mentality of sex that was going through the church, where it's like it is holier to abstain completely.
Yeah.
And he's saying, hold on a second, there's nothing wrong with sex, don't deprive each other. And that was the culture, and that was the framing where he was speaking into that.
Yeah, because he was speaking into a Hellenistic culture. Mm-hmm. That Hellenistic just means kind of the Greeks, the Romans, that kind of area. So, I mean, it is technically the Greeks, but then the Romans kind of
right. Which is why even though it was in the Roman Empire, the New Testament was written in Greek.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of all that there, but that's exactly what was happening. Is people were saying anything that is not actively spiritual must therefore be less than anything that is actively spiritual. Mm-hmm. But what they're defining spiritual as is whether or not you're experiencing it with your body or with your soul.
Right.
And God made both.
Yeah, and let's not forget how many of Jesus's miracles were very much in the physical realm, right? He fed the 4,000, he fed the 5,000, he healed diseases, he cast out demons, he stopped the wind and the waves. Mm-hmm. Like he did so much in the physical realm, and God made our physical bodies, and we're even going to have physical bodies in the resurrection. And so the physical is not a bad thing.
No, but the thing is, we've seen throughout history, you know, obviously all these whole philosophical movements have gotten their fame and their kind of popularity among all different classes and walks of life, and people with lots of money, people with no money. Mm-hmm. But what we have seen a lot over and over and over again is that throughout history, and we're not just talking about Stoicism and Gnosticism anymore, a lot of these kind of mentalities of just focus on God or just focus on virtue, and if you're focusing on your hardship in the present, you're not as good of a Christian, are often really, really promoted towards those who are in bad situations.
Yes.
That's actually why John Calvin had such an important message in that time. He spoke a lot to like the message of Calvinism, where it's like, you are in your position for a purpose. Mm-hmm. You are here for a reason. Mm-hmm. I mean, that actually was it felt quite liberating to your peasants.
Yes.
It was like, my great-great-grandfather was the peasant's land worker of the great-great-grandfather of the current landlord, yes. And my great-great-grandson will likely also be a peasant in this same hut. Yes. Yes. You know, and I think like being able to tell those people who are in, frankly, situations that are not going to change, that they have to learn to live with, it gives them a little bit of a balm where it's like, maybe God put me in this horrible situation for a purpose, and they really take off. Yeah. And so it makes sense why people like this teaching, in essence.
And it was very much preached to the slaves as well.
And that was a big one I was going to say next.
Yeah. American slavery. And we find it in modern marriage teaching, which is what I want to talk about today. And I put something on Facebook a couple of weeks ago where I said, I sometimes wonder if most Christian marriage authors and influencers have good marriages. I just read a meme regarding marriage that said, God, I can't do this alone. I need your help and grace. What if marriage is God's grace to you? Or at least what if it should be? I know many marriages are hard and many marriages can't be saved, and many of us go through very difficult seasons. But when those who teach about marriage make it sound like being married is a huge hard slog that they can't get through without God's grace, well, that's weird, isn't it? My marriage makes my life easier. There has never been a day in my life, even when I'm mad at Keith, when I would have thought that marriage is one of the hardest things in my life. Maybe the problem is that we talk about marriage as if it is hard, and then when people are dating and the relationship is awful, they figure, well, that's just how marriage is. They don't recognize red flags, and so they may marry someone they didn't suit or who has bad character. And then, yes, marriage is going to be hard. But ideally, marriage should be God's gift to us, not something that we need his power to get through. Now, obviously, we do need God's power for everyday life, and I said that later in the comments, but like this idea that we cannot get through this, like save God, I would die, and it would not work. That's a really negative way of framing marriage. And let me also say, if your marriage is really hard, I'm afraid that the idea that marriage is hard will mean that you may not recognize that your situation is actually worse than normal and you do need help. If all marriage is hard, then you may think what you're going through is just par for the course and just something to be endured. Or when you talk to others, they may downplay your pain because, well, all marriage is hard. No, marriage shouldn't ideally be hard. And if it is, that means you need help to make it better. Hard isn't just something to be endured because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that we teach that marriage is hard really does make people think that when they're choosing a marriage partner, choosing someone that makes their life easier would not even necessarily come into the equation.
Well, and we hear from so many women, too, who are married to people where marriage is hard. They don't feel they have the right to speak up and say, I can't live in this anymore, because then they're weaker than everyone else who's able to manage their hard marriages.
And I just want to say, I do need to take a step back here and say, we're not saying that marriage is always going to make your life easier.
Yes.
You could be married to someone who's in a car accident and becomes a quadriplegic, and now you need that's your responsibility to help them.
Yeah.
Because that's what a covenant means. And so sometimes life happens and things happen that are very difficult. We had a son pass away. These things are hard and life can be hard, but there's a huge difference between circumstances happening that are hard, external circumstances, and things that we just adopt or contribute to or think, well, I just need to accept this the way it is.
Here's the difference, is obviously having kids always makes your life more complicated. Yes. Always makes your life more difficult, right? Mm-hmm. My life was fundamentally easier before I had Alex.
Yes. Yes.
Now, I wouldn't trade my life with Alex for anything in the world.
Yeah, I think you have his snot on your shoulder right now.
Oh my goodness. No, that's banana from this morning.
Okay, that's banana. There you go. But that just shows
it. It just shows I have banana on my shoulder. But the point is, life is definitely harder having a child, but that doesn't mean that my life feels like I'm miserable about it. It's a good kind of harder. It's every day I'm grateful that I get to do this. Even if I don't, and I know I say that and it sounds like I'm sitting on a beach saying, wow, my life is so wonderful. But sometimes you're just overwhelmed, but you're still I wouldn't trade this for anything else. Mm-hmm. That's often where we get mixed up, where people say, but my marriage, but marriage is sometimes hard. Sometimes you just deal with financial difficulties. Someone loses a job. Someone, maybe your partner has long-term health issues. Maybe you're a blended family and there's just difficulties with that. And these are things where it's yes, but that's a life issue.
Yeah.
We're not saying that when you get married, you don't have to deal with life anymore.
Right.
What we're saying is parenting is really hard for me. It is. I love it. Yeah. But it's hard for everyone. It would be a whole lot harder if I didn't have Connor. Mm-hmm. But I know there are a lot of women who are not in that situation.
Yeah.
Where they actually become single parents and it's easier for them.
Yeah.
Because their spouse is making more work. That's what we're talking about here. Where it's life is hard. Yeah. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Life is hard. Mm-hmm. But does your marriage, even if your marriage is the root cause of some of the life things, you wouldn't have been married to someone with long-term health issues. Right. Or you wouldn't have been married to someone who, then loses their job or something. Even if the marriage is technically the cause, is it a life is hard kind of situation? Or is it your spouse is actively making your life harder than it needs to be in this life is hard situation?
Yeah. And then the problem becomes that our Christian advice to people who are in a marriage where their spouse is actually making their life harder.
Yeah.
Is give up expectations. Give up desire. The reason that this is hard is because you want something. If you stop wanting it, then it will no longer be hurting you.
And that's just what we're talking about with the Gnostic and the Stoic mentality of your problem is you're still too attached to the physical.
Right.
So your problem is that you want to have a spouse who helps out with housework. Mm-hmm. Your problem is that you want to feel heard in your marriage in a way that, makes you feel heard. So maybe if you can just learn to not need that, then your marriage will be better.
Yeah, because the problem is your desire or your expectation in the first place.
Yeah.
And so if we get rid of desire, then there is no more suffering.
Yeah.
If we get rid of desire, then you can't suffer because you're not missing anything. Yeah. And so the focus becomes on getting people to be content with things that they should not actually be content with.
Or also it gets people content with giving up things that God actually wants for us. Mm-hmm. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and become one with his wife. Like we're supposed to want that intimacy. Yeah. We're supposed to want for, our spouse to cleave from his family and cleave to us. This idea that we shouldn't want things that are healthy because if we don't get them, we'll be disappointed. Means that instead what's happening is we are closing ourselves off from the blessings of God because we're not willing to call people to actually act like Christ.
Yeah. And so let's say you're in a marriage and your spouse is really doing something which is disrupting intimacy.
Yeah.
Maybe they're never taking on their share of housework, childcare, mental load, whatever, and you're just completely overwhelmed.
Yeah. Maybe they're just not sharing influence.
Yeah, maybe they really don't care about your input on things.
No.
Maybe they're completely cut off sexually and don't want to take any steps to try to sort that out. Whatever it might be. And the solution to that should not be, well, just don't care about it.
Yeah.
The solution should be, how can I fight for intimacy?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're missing, is like we think that the Christian thing to do is to go to God and say, God, you can supply all my needs.
But it's the same God who says, taste and see that the Lord is good.
Yeah. And maybe what God wants for you and your spouse is to achieve real intimacy. And that means you stepping up.
Obviously, I have a toddler. Okay. Everyone who listens to the podcast knows I have a son. He is 22 months now when we're recording this. And he is I will just say, he just shares his father and my personality a lot, so we saw this coming. But he's very strong-willed.
Yes.
He's very emotional. So strong-willed's from Connor, the emotional's from me. It's a great combination. But as a result, I've been doing a lot of research into modern parenting practices with like temper tantrums and with, hitting and outbursts and stuff because he's a 2-year-old, right? Yes. And what all the experts that I'm reading, all the psychologists are all saying is, what a lot of parents and toddlers get into this horrible dynamic where the toddler does something bad, like hit, and they get this huge reaction from mom and dad, and the toddler eventually learns mom and dad will yell at me or punish or whatever for 7 minutes, and then I will get a cookie.
Yes.
And then I will be able to play again, and then I will be able to do X, Y, Z. So they learn in essence, okay, if I hit mommy, they will say, no, we do not hit, and I will go in timeout for 2 minutes, and then I will have gotten my frustration out, and I can go back to play. Mm-hmm. And they learn, actually, hitting is worth it. Yeah. I am willing to pay 2 minutes in timeout for hitting, because they had this emotional outburst, and they're like, yep, that's worth it, I'll do it. Yeah. And so there's other ways to deal with it instead, versus what we naturally want to do, which is like, meet that outburst with another outburst, right? So anyway, but what a lot of these psychologists were saying, which just made me laugh so hard, is that a lot of us are 2-year-olds any chance we get.
Okay.
Right? So what happens is we do X. We know we're not supposed to do X. Okay? Mm-hmm. We know it's not great to do X. But we know that if we do X, our partner will be mad and hissy for 10 days. Mm-hmm. We will have to have approximately 3 to 4 heartfelt conversations where we need to talk. Uh-huh. Life will be miserable for 5 days, and then everything will kind of go back to normal. And we're like, you know what? I'm gonna do X because that's worth it.
Yeah.
If the price of X is worth it, and I know everything's gonna go back to normal in a little bit, I'm gonna do it. Yeah. And this often happens subconsciously.
Yes.
We're not actively trying to manipulate our spouses. But often we do things where it's like, okay, I would rather not do this. And so I'm just not going to. I'm going to deal with the ramifications because the ramifications of not doing it are not going to be that bad.
Yeah.
And it's all going to go back to normal. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to say with this whole Marriage is Hard series is sometimes you need to recognize that your spouse is being a toddler.
Yeah.
And you have to make it so that the actual repercussion of their action isn't simply a short-term burst, but is actually training and working together to have different skills, a different normal, and a different routine so that the behavior just stops happening.
Mm-hmm. Because God wants intimacy for us. He wants intimacy. And if your spouse is doing something which is sowing disunity in the relationship, then your spouse should not get to reap intimacy. Because then you're not going to have intimacy. Your spouse might feel great, but you're not going to feel great. You might say, well, I guess things just have to get back to normal now because nothing I say is working. And so your spouse feels like everything is normal, but inside you are dying.
Yeah, and that's like the parents are like, well, nothing's working, so I'm just going to let my kid do whatever he wants, right?
But inside, in that marriage, inside you are dying, but you've allowed everything to externally get back to normal.
Yeah.
Because you feel like, well, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, so the wife brings up the fact that, like, I feel like I am drowning. I cannot do this anymore. Everything is on my shoulders, and it's just too much. And the husband says his whole thing, whatever it is, and they talk about, they fight, she pushes, he does a half-hearted attempt to maybe wash 4 dishes after dinner once. She reminds him again, and then it's like, it's even more half-hearted, and she realizes nothing's going to change, and so she just goes back to doing all the dishes.
Yeah.
Right?
And he's learned that if he just puts up enough of a stink,
then he doesn't have to actually do anything.
Or maybe it's something that she's doing, she's overspending. He can't get a handle on it. He keeps buying her stuff because she keeps wanting more things, or whatever it might be. Maybe she's got some major trauma issues and she won't go see a counselor. And it's just erupting
and she's
in their
taking
marriage.
it out on the kids or something too.
And it's not always one way. We're not saying that it's the guy who's the bad one here, but what we're saying is that often in the relationship, one spouse really wants to build intimacy and the other one is working directly against that.
Yeah.
But because we hear marriage is hard, we hear that it is a sin for me to actually want change. And so you might speak up once because you're desperate, but then eventually you just let things get back to normal, but inside you're dying.
Yeah, and then
you think the problem is I am dying rather than the problem is my spouse isn't caring about me.
Yeah, and I think the thing is a lot of women especially, because remember this message is primarily given to women. It is also given to men. Okay, but like if you're in a marriage where your spouse is actively harming you or like your emotional well-being or is harming the marriage or is just making life more difficult than it needs to be, you can feel very trapped. Like I either need to accept that my marriage is bad or I can accept that I'm the problem. Or I can see this as a sanctifying opportunity. Or I can, just remind myself that this is just God's way of making me holier. Yeah. And that can be a psychological kind of escape hatch that allows us to feel really good about the marriage short term, even when we're miserable. So it allows us to not accept reality for that little bit longer.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like you're closing your eyes because the scary part's coming, but you're not willing to actually face it.
Yeah. And so what we're looking at this month is, are we doing marriage on hard mode? Are we making marriage harder than it needs to be? Partly from the way we talk about marriage.
Yeah.
The way that we talk about how, it's just such a hard slog and it's the hardest thing you'll ever do.
Yeah.
You were at a wedding once.
Oh my goodness. I was at a wedding once. Oh, I love listening to everyone's least favorite part of a wedding is the homily that the pastor gives. It's one of my favorite parts. I love listening to him, so I'm so curious what people say. Right. So I think it says a lot about you. Yeah. So there's one wedding I was at where the pastor was just going on and on. He turned to like the wife first and then the husband next, and he would say to one, you're going to wake up one day and you're not even going to recognize the person beside you. It's not going to be the man that you fell in love with. It's just going to be this old dude who doesn't ever put his socks in the hamper, and you're going to be thinking, wish I had a baseball bat right about now, And then he turns to the husband and he's like, you're going to wake up and the gorgeous young woman you married is going to be this old woman who, just nags at you all the time, and you're going to be like, maybe death is better. And it actually, he talked about killing your spouse or killing yourself in this homily. Like, I am sorry, there is no reason to do that at a wedding. But then he concluded with, and that's how Christ sees us. And it was like, has anyone checked on this man's wife?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure that the idea of Christ and the church being like a marriage symbolism is not Christ hates you with every piece of bone in his body because you've grinded on his nerves for 28 years and all he wants to do is just, escape from you by any means necessary, but he'll stick around. Yeah. It's like, no, like we're supposed to actually love each other.
Yes.
And that does not sound like wanting to murder each other every day. And I think that when we have this marriage is hard mentality, we don't put in the work to make a marriage good, because when it's hard, that's seen as normal. It's not seen as a red flag that something is wrong.
Exactly. And so as we're looking at it this month, we're going to ask the question, am I going through hardships in my life because they're just there?
Like, life is just hard.
Yeah,
is this a just life is hard situation?
Or am I contributing to the hardship in some way by the things that we're believing, by the way we're acting, and can we do things just not to have to do marriage on hard mode? And our plea as we're going through this is that we stop talking about marriage as being such a terrible thing, because this whole idea that I need God's grace to stay married and to stay sane, how do non-Christians have good marriages then?
Well, my thing too is it's just, I would find it quite horrifying and offensive if Connor talked like that about me.
Yeah.
Like, the only way I'm able to stay with this horrendous woman is because God is giving me the strength to stay.
Yeah.
Like, that's just horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like we've said, you know, there's a lot of people listening who we know you're in a good marriage. You love your spouse, and it's just hard right now. You know, maybe you're dealing with financial insecurity. Maybe you're dealing with, you know, an unexpected medical diagnosis. Maybe,
or maybe you are having trouble relating to each other because marriage has brought out some trauma that one of you hasn't dealt with, and it needs to get dealt with, but it will get dealt with. But it's hard in the meantime.
You're in a period of life where life is just hard right now.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, we're going to have some tips for you as well.
Yes.
Where you're in a good marriage. It's not like anyone is actively trying to take advantage of the other, but you are just in a life is just hard situation. That's fine. That's not what we're talking about here, okay? So, but there are a lot of people out there who are living marriages that are far harder than they need to be, under the guise of, well, I'm just doing the sanctifying work of Christ in my life right now, when really what they should be doing is flipping some tables and figuring out, how do we stop putting ourselves through more misery than necessary because I am enabling selfishness, or because you are being a selfish person?
Yeah, and of course, there's people who are in marriages that are truly destructive.
Thank you. Yeah, and then there's that one.
It's not, it's not even that you're enabling. It's just, it's very destructive, and you don't realize that this isn't normal.
Yes.
Because we've been told our whole lives that, well, marriage is just hard, and that's what we heard over and over again in the comments on Facebook, as women said, I stayed for 15 years longer than I should have.
Exactly.
Because I just thought this is just what marriage is.
Yeah.
And that's a terrible picture of marriage. So we're going to look at how we can try to do life and marriage on easy mode rather than hard mode, so that we have the emotional resources, the financial resources, the time resources to really live out our calling in all fullness and joy, rather than get bogged down in this slog that we were really never meant to have.
And then also, it does mean that when the life is hard stuff comes, you can actually get through it a lot easier.
Yes, exactly. I got some new research for you.
Okay.
You haven't heard this one.
No, I haven't.
Okay. So
I love it when you spring research on me that I haven't gotten to read yet.
Yes, so we have in our new research segment of the week where we because we are research-based. The Great Sex Rescue was a research-based book. We surveyed 20,000 women, did a full literature review, did focus groups, etc. And we are trying to ask that when people talk about marriage and sex and these sorts of things, we use actual research and actual data.
Yes.
And so we like to highlight different areas of research, not our own, but just other people who are doing research in this field. And here, our good friend Camden Morgante, who has written for our blog and who has been a guest on the podcast as well. She's a licensed clinical psychologist, and she wrote an article outlining a recent study in the American Sociological Review, which looked at structural sexism and health. And so what they did...
I actually have read this article already.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I have. You didn't know that.
Okay. So what they did was they looked at people who were going to churches where women were in leadership in some way versus people who were going to churches where women weren't. And then they just measured women's health.
Yeah.
And what they found is that women who go to churches where women are in leadership tend to be healthier and live longer than women who go to churches where women are not in leadership. And here's the other thing, and this is something which we were trying to figure out how to dissect in our survey, because one of the problems we had with the Great Sex Rescue is that we found that being religious tended to lead to better marriages.
Yes, and we're not the only ones who found that.
And being religious tends to lead to better outcomes for your kids. But then we looked at all these specific beliefs and we found, but those beliefs actually lead to worse outcomes. So what's going on? And that's what they found, is that yes, being religious helps, but when you compare people's health benefits of going to church versus people who don't go to church, it only helps if you're going to churches where women are in leadership.
Yes,
when women are not in leadership, the health benefits of being religious evaporate.
For women, not for men.
For women, not for men, yes.
And that's exactly the issue, is we do find that kind of, in general, religious affiliation tends to just kind of seem to help men, mostly likely because men are given positions of authority in every church.
Yep. And so here, I'm just going to read you their results. We find that among religious participants, women who attend sexist religious institutions report significantly worse self-rated health than do those who attend more inclusive congregations. Furthermore, only women who attend inclusive religious institutions exhibit a health advantage relative to non-participants. We observe marginal to no statistically significant effects among men. Our results suggest the health benefits of religious participation do not extend to groups that are systematically excluded from power and status within their religious institutions.
Yep.
And we will put a link there in the show notes, both to the study and to Camden's article about it, which was really good.
Yeah, and we're right now, we're in the middle of writing and researching for our mother-daughter book. And this is one of the things where, especially if you have young girls, having your daughters being raised in a church where they are taught from day one, you are less worthy. You are just less than because of your sex. Mm-hmm. You're going to have a lot of positive benefits because of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. We know that a lot of studies, not just ours, have found that religiosity in general means that you're happier. You have better mental health outcomes. You feel a greater purpose in life. Mm-hmm. But those things all have to do with personal religious pregnancy brain is making it. What's the thing when you believe something strongly? Conviction. Yes, personal religious convictions. And so, teach your kids about Jesus and teach your kids to have a relationship with Jesus first. But also, make sure you're not putting up an unnecessary barrier in front of your daughter's faith walk by having her in a community that tells her you are less than, God trusts you less, God desires less from you because you are a woman. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we know that there's different doctrinal beliefs about women in leadership, and we totally get that, and we're not even going to enter those debates.
No.
There's other great websites and books to go to if you want to examine those further. We're just trying to bring out the research, and we're just simply saying, hey, you know what? Women who go to churches where they aren't allowed to make decisions or in leadership, they do tend to report more depression, more chronic pain, more of those sorts of things. So it's just an interesting finding.
Yep. And you can't ignore the numbers.
Right. Research should matter.
And it really should. Because I think personally, for me anyway, this has been a really good check for pride. Because, our research found some stuff that you and I, didn't expect.
Right.
First of all, Joanna too. I mean, we're all blown away by some things, and it's something where you really makes you step backwards and say, okay, that was my assumption. But if our research is showing that it's harming people, maybe we were wrong.
Yeah. And Maya Angelou, this saying is everywhere on the internet right now. When you know better, you do better. And that is what we are calling people to do. That is why in February, a new version of The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex is coming out.
Yep.
The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex and The Good Girl's Guide is the 10th anniversary. I completely rewrote the book. And it's not even that it scored badly on our rubric. It's just... I feel like I know so much more than when I wrote in 2012, and there was a lot that I really wanted to change.
Well, we know 20,000 women more.
Yeah, and so I completely rewrote the book. I pulled several books out of publication, my earliest ones, because I'm just not comfortable with that, because that's what we do. When we know better, we do better, and our cry for the Christian community is to let's start looking at research, please, and let's do things in an emotionally healthy way. Okay, we now have an interview to share with you.
And I think a lot of you are going to be excited about this one. Yeah, because loved his first interview.
A while ago, we had Bruce Fleming on to talk about Genesis 3 and a new way of seeing what we call the curse of Eve. He's arguing that it's not a curse at all. And a number of people started following him. And we now have him here to talk about Ephesians 5. I have on the podcast Bruce Fleming again. Bruce joined us a couple of months ago now, I think, when we were talking about Genesis 3, and I had so much positive feedback from that. Everyone's been saying, what does Bruce think of head when it says that man is the head of the wife? And so I have Bruce Fleming back on. So hello, Bruce.
Hello. Thank you, Sheila.
Yes, I know I've had so many requests for you. So this is great. So today you thought I gave you free reign to decide what we were going to talk about next. And you thought the Ephesians 5 passage was the most important to deal with first.
I like to get a detailed answer from a detailed passage.
Mm-hmm.
So there is talk about heads in 1 Corinthians 11:3 and in Ephesians 5:23.
Mm-hmm.
The more detailed passages in Ephesians chapter 5. So
Okay.
if we can go there, I'd like to go there first.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay. On the Eden podcast, we go into, in Genesis season 1, we talked about the Garden of Eden and how people aren't understanding the two parts where God says to the woman, you're going to have two things. You're going to have sorrowful toil and you're going to have conception. And,
right.
And my wife, Joy, Dr. Joy Fleming, showed how that's linked back to the verse before it and the verse after it. So we've got those two things. Well, when she did that, I began looking at the New Testament, and I said, this influences how I look at the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And so she said, great, let's see what that means. So in Genesis 3:16, we don't have a curse on the woman, and we don't have God saying to her, I'm going to put him over in charge of you, even though he's the rebellious one. We don't have any of that.
Right.
So that's in season 1 of the Eden.
And Genesis 3:16 again is the verse that we often mistranslate as like her desire will be to sort of rule over the husband or take authority from the husband, but he shall rule over you. And weird stuff's going on there.
That's why we did a whole book. And we put out the Book of Eden, and we got that clarified, I hope.
Yes. And I'll put a link in the podcast notes that go along with this podcast to the original podcast where you dealt with the Genesis 3 to say that, no, God did not curse the man. God did not curse the woman. And this whole idea that he is going to be over her is not a curse. It's just saying that's what's going to happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So then in season 2, we went through this and we talked about, and I have the word beyond. Beyond Eden, because the great unity that you have in the Garden of Eden, where they're naked and unashamed, and they're in a great relationship with God and with each other, Paul really goes beyond that, and he says in Ephesians chapter 5, I'm talking about this great mystery. And in the New Testament, a mystery is something that was previously hidden, but now is revealed. So he says we could call it revelation. So I'm talking about this, not just a revelation, but this great revelation. And he's talking about Christ and the church. And so when I hit that verse in Ephesians 5:32, I thought, now I know what this whole passage is about. He's talking about this great mystery, Christ and the church. But people have said in their headings and the way they print the Bibles, they say, no, this whole passage up to that verse is about marriage. Yeah. And it's about him being over her and all kinds of things. And so what I had to do is I had to say, I don't know what this passage is about. I'm going to go back and start with Ephesians. So there are 6 chapters in Ephesians, and the first 3 chapters, that's a good theological section. The last 3 chapters, that's a good practical section.
Yes.
And in Greek, he says, therefore walk, as he starts chapter 4, verse 1. And then a few verses later on, he says, therefore walk not. And then he says, therefore walk. And I thought, I've got a pattern here. Therefore walk not. Therefore, in 5:15, therefore walk very carefully. And in 6:10, he says, therefore stand. So we've got 5 walks and 1 stand. I think that counts. So we've got 6 sections. So if I'm interested in the last part of Ephesians 5, I have to start with 5:15 and go all the way through 6:9. Even though there's a big number 6 there, like there's a chapter break, his whole section really starts at 5:15 and goes to 6:9.
Right, because those chapter breaks were put in later. They were not put in by Paul, just so everyone knows.
Centuries later, and then they tried and they did a pretty good job, but not in this case. So then I go to 5:15 and I say, I want to get into the middle of this passage, but I got to start at the beginning. All right. What happens in 5:15? He has 4 sets of commands. He says, therefore do this, but don't do that. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do this. Don't do that. And then he says the 4th one is being filled with the Spirit in 5:18. And what he's developing now is a pattern of 4s. And I like Sherlock Holmes, and he has an episode called The Sign of the 4. All right. So I found my sign of the 4. And in those first 4, The fourth one is the bigger one, the most important one. And not only that, he takes that fourth one and uses that and elaborates on it in another pattern of fours that opens in 519a. So he's got 19a, 19b, 20, 21, four more. And the big idea is in verse 21, which has to do with submitting yourselves one to another. But then he takes that and he opens up that concept in 21, and he goes all the way down to verse 6, 9. All of the rest of that passage is about 521.
Yeah, it's how do you submit to one another?
Yeah. And so that's great. Then he's got the pattern of fours going again. He says, as Christ in 23b, as Christ in 25b, as Christ later on, just before 29b. And then he hits us with the big fourth one, which is, I'm speaking about Christ in the church. Just as the husband and wife were one flesh, I'm saying that the church and the body of Christ are one flesh. Still, I'm looking for this head body. What does that mean? And I went back to Ephesians 3 and I came up with this verse in Ephesians 3:6. So he says that the non-Jews should be joint heirs and a joint body and joint sharers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. So what he's talking about is this joint body metaphor. In Africa, I was working on this. We were in a little Bible institute in the middle of the jungle. And it was pretty quiet. And I was standing outside the front porch, just looking down, thinking about this husband as the head of the wife. And I noticed a train of ants walking across the corner of our step. And they have big ants out there. And I thought, those ants are made up of a joint body. They have the head, they have the abdomen and the thorax. They got three different parts. No one part of the body is the body, but all three parts together make a joint body. Now, humans have a two-part joint body. We have the head and we have the torso. So if I'm going to talk about a unity of the husband and wife in the Garden of Eden, I'm going to say they were in one joint body, one whole marriage together. And the same thing now is in the book of Ephesians, where he says, I want to talk to you about a unity. I want to talk about husbands and wives being joined together. And I want to talk about something even more important, and that's the Christ and the church being joined together. So if we start back now in 521, which is going to launch the rest of the passage, he takes the verse to submit and he redoes it. And you've gone into this previously before, I know. The big thing about 1 Corinthians 11:3 and Ephesians 5:25 is that people go there looking for two key words. They look for submission and they look for headship.
Right.
There was a missing link that was talked a lot about, where people say, what's the missing link between the ape and humans? What's that missing link? Well, the missing link is still missing. There are two missing links now in 1 Corinthians 11:3 and Ephesians 5. Headship is missing and submission is missing. Neither one is in either of these passages. But if we come to Ephesians 5 thinking it's all about marriage, and we think it's about headship, and we think it's about submission, then we get off the track and we get ourselves into trouble.
So what is it about? It's about the headship of Christ in the church?
Yes, it's about, well, not the headship. It's about the unity of Christ and the church.
Okay.
Christ and the church are united, and they are not one part better than the other. So then Paul takes it all, and here's where I was laying on the floor of my office here some years back, and I was looking at the ceiling up above, and I was trying to reflect on this, and all of a sudden it hit me. Paul has built the second half of Ephesians 5 like Genesis chapter 3 was built. There's the two main ideas, and then there's a link up and a link down. And in Ephesians 5:25b, he says, Jesus did these two things for us. Christ loved the church, and he gave himself up for it. Now, Paul is an Old Testament scholar. He knows his scripture, and he's got it right. And so he takes this illustration, the way it's built in 3:16, and he says, just as Christ gave himself for the church, and he links that back up to 5:23b. And then Christ loved the church. He links that down to the section below it. So we've got a 1, 2, 3 section with two main ideas being illustrated. And the two ideas are how Christ loved the church and how he gave himself up for it.
Right. So it isn't really, now the only thing, okay, here I'm going to push back a little bit. So I've argued this as well, is that the whole idea of how Christ relates to the church in that passage isn't about authority. It's about love and service and how he gave himself up. But then people say, but Christ is an authority over the church.
Christ is the Lord of all.
Mm-hmm.
And you might want to find that idea in some other passage, but it's not in this passage.
Right, because you would see it in Philippians 2, for instance, where it's like every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. But what
Yeah,
you're saying is, yes, that's true, but that's not the point of this passage.
right. In Ephesians 2, he emptied himself. He emptied and
Right.
gave himself
Yeah.
up. No, in this passage, the main point is Christ and the church are one unit. So he's trying to explain that main thing. And he builds two sections around it. The first section is this three-part as Christ, as Christ, as Christ. And the second part is as the husband and wife, as parents and children, and as masters and slaves. All of it is rotating around the very center, which is 532.
Right.
So his big idea is 532. If we get that, the great mystery of the unity of Christ and the church, then we understand the rest of the passage.
Okay, so the only way to understand how Paul was talking about marriage is really to look at what Paul meant by Christ and the church. That's what you're saying.
That's right. If there are a couple of quotations in 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Corinthians 11 that I like to put quotation marks around.
Uh-huh.
1 Corinthians 11, 4-6, you put quotation marks around it and you realize that those aren't Paul's ideas. He's responding to those ideas. You go to 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, you put quotation marks around them. Those aren't Paul's ideas. He's responding to those ideas.
Yeah.
In Ephesians, I think we need to put a parenthesis around several parts. If you look at the middle of 523, the first part where the husband's ahead of the wife, you can put a parenthesis around that. The beginning of 525, you can put a parenthesis about that around that where it says, husbands, love your wives. And the same thing with the third section. Why? Because he's trying to give us an idea, the pattern of fours. He says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of Christ. Then he says, as Christ gave himself up for the church, himself, the Savior. And then as Christ loved and gave himself, and then as Christ loved. So the main thread of that is as Christ, as Christ, as Christ, and then Christ and the church are one. Along the way, he does talk about husbands and wives in one unit. He does talk about husbands, love your wives, and he does talk about love yourself, take care of your body. But from 526 on, he's not talking about marriage anymore at all. He's very clearly, he's all about Christ and the church. So that we've gone to that passage and we've said, tell me more about marriage and tell me about submission, tell me about headship. And so we've pulled that idea, but we've really poured that idea into the passage. He's not talking about that at all.
Okay, interesting. So the whole concept, like the word headship, isn't actually like it's kind of a made up term. Like there isn't really such a thing as headship, because it's building this whole doctrine of authority around something where Paul was trying to make an analogy of how Christ relates to the church, right? Is that what you're saying?
If you go back to this submission that he takes apart and rebuilds in 521, instead of saying that we must submit to somebody who is over us and we're under, so there's an over-under submission, a vertical submission, and that's what the word means all over. He takes it and he rebuilds it and he says, no, submitting one to another in the fear of Christ. And he also, that's the pattern of fours. There's a parallelism with 519a where he says, speaking to one another. And if you look in Colossians 3:16, he uses that same phrase and he says, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. All right. So we can fill in that speaking and make it out. That's a simple word, but we have more details from Colossians. So we're teaching and admonishing one another. Now, if I'm being filled with the Spirit and I'm teaching and admonishing one another, and the parallel to that is submitting ourselves one to another, what am I submitting to? I'm submitting to the teaching that I'm getting from other Christians, and I'm submitting to the admonishing or the corrections I'm getting from other Christians. That's not about marriage at all. It's about old and new, male and female, all of us in the body of Christ. We're teaching what we know, or we're reminding people about what we know, and we're correcting, and then we're submitting ourselves one to another. So there's a beautiful unity, just like the heart pumps out the red blood and then it comes back as the purple blood. We've got the whole system functioning together. So we have this teaching and submitting working together. We have the correcting and submitting working together. That's what's going on in 19a and 21.
I've heard that before too, that part of submitting is listening to others and listening to and being open to their admonishing. So I've heard that from other people too. I really like that. I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that in today's culture we have such a preoccupation with power and authority, and so we tend to read that into the scripture, whereas and in Roman times, they did as well. I mean, it was a very power dominant society, but Jesus specifically said that it was not to be that way with us. You know, the Son of Man came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Like we're not supposed to be aiming for power and authority, et cetera, et cetera. And so Paul enters into that. And I feel like in his writings, he's continuing that thought of Jesus, that it's about how we relate to one another. Like the only place that I've found in scripture, and we don't need to go there necessarily, but where Paul actually talks about authority in marriage is 1 Corinthians 7, where he says it's shared. You know, the husband doesn't have authority over his body, but yielded to the wife. The wife doesn't have authority over her body, but yielded to the husband. So the authority is completely mutual and shared. And that's the only time he actually talks about authority. Other than that, it really is this idea of serving and submission in different ways.
So I'm involved in pastoral training. That's the kind of ministry that I've done all my life. And if we're teaching pastors, we're trying to teach them, how does the church function first? Mm-hmm. Now, one of the practical things is, how does the household function? Mm-hmm. And what he does starting on 533 is he says, I got 3 more points here that are balanced off by what was just said before. I'm talking about the husbands and wives. And there's nothing except we've got a mutual relationship going there. He takes a hook and takes the word fear, and he goes back to 521, which is the fear. So he's saying, right. see, I'm referring to this mutual submission. And so we have the husbands and wives, and some people put a word obey in there, but that's not at the end of chapter 5. There's nothing about obedience. Then he moves to chapter 6, and he does use the word obey. He says, children, obey. And he says, servants, obey.
Yeah.
So he's got, but each time he tries to undo it, at the very end, he says, servants, you got to do it this way. And then he says, and masters, you do the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's outrageous. How could he say masters do the same thing? And people get hung up in 6:4, where they say this is fathers are in charge of the whole house. Mm-hmm. But that very word for fathers is used in Hebrews, where it talks about the parents of Moses. Right. In Greek, it's pateros. These parents of Moses, you know, how they raised him when he was, you know, they had to put him in the bulrushes, and they took care of him. So those parents of Moses were faithful. And in this way, 6:4, it says, parents, don't provoke your children to wrath, not fathers. Mm-hmm. So we've got mothers and fathers in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. We've got in a united relationship between the two, a reciprocal relationship. Now, children aren't always children. They grow up and they can become adults. And slaves aren't always slaves. A lot of times they could have been liberated when the Jubilee year came around, or read the book of Philemon. So yes. As long as they are, though, they're in that relationship of obedience. But Paul says, no, I want you to treat each other the same way. Because we are united, we're in one body in Christ. So we've got those 3 illustrations after 532. We've got 3 illustrations before 32, but he's just pounding on this idea of 532. Christ and the church make one unity, and it's even better than the relationship we had in the Garden of Eden. It goes beyond Eden.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely. So you're just saying head is literally head, just like the ant. You got the head, you got the body, and they're both together and they're joint, and that's the whole point of it.
Yeah, we don't get any farther abstract than that. So some people say, well, head means, well, no. If you can't say, I've got my wife and myself, we are joined in the flesh in one head and one body, we can't do that. So we have to take it figuratively. But there are different levels of abstraction when you go figurative. And if you can take the simplest level of abstraction, that's the best. So what's the simplest? Well, we've got a head, we've got a body, the two go together, we have one unit. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. So if the simple sense makes sense, seek no other sense. Mm-hmm. People don't like that, or they didn't realize that was an option, and they go farther for something more abstract. So they say, well, head means source. Mm-hmm. And they come up with their reasons for that. Others say, no, head means authority, and they come up with their reasons for that. And I've watched with interest at this group and this group criticize the other person's position on that. And I think they do a great job of destroying each other. All right, well, that's the very abstract thing. We don't need any of that stuff. We go back to the simple level of abstraction that the two form one unity. They form one unit, one whole body, one functioning togetherness. And it's great. It's a wonderful thing. So husband's the head of the wife. That's right. Husband and wife form one unit. As Christ is the head of the church. That's right. We have one unit. And you go over into 1 Corinthians, as the Father and the Son are united. That's right. We have the Godhead. Add the Holy Spirit, we have the Trinity. No heresy where people say, well, we've got, God is more important than the submissive son. No. We just have a wonderful unity, and they're put together and they're reciprocally relating one to another.
That's beautiful. And again, I just want to say, when we try to make the New Testament all about power and authority, we're missing the whole point. And so I love this, how you can just read it the way it is. And when you read it the way it is, it makes a lot of sense.
We're called as Christians to do what then? Just what Christ's example was. He loved and he gave of himself. So in marriage, what are we called to do? We're called to love, agape love, husbands, agape love, wives, agape love, God's love. And we're called to give of ourselves. We're supposed to look for the best. We're supposed to give of ourselves, sacrifice for the other to build up the whole unit.
That's beautiful. Well, Bruce, where can people find you?
Our website is true316.com. That's TRU316.com. And then from there, you'll find links to the Eden podcast or the Book of Eden and other things that we do.
Great. And I will put those links in the show notes as well. So thank you so much for joining us again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your ministry, Sheila.
Really interesting. I will put links where you can follow Bruce in the podcast notes that goes along with this podcast. And now, just to end it off, we have some gifts to give away. Now, we are recording this quite a few weeks before it airs, and so I can't announce the winners. But suffice to say that we have given out 2 prizes, 2 orgasm courses, one to someone who signed up last week and one to someone who has already signed up. And we will put those names in the newsletter that goes out on Friday. But we're going to give out some more prizes. So if you sign up to our email list, the link is in the podcast notes. You could win either your choice of an orgasm course or our puberty whole story course, where you can talk to your mothers, can talk to their daughters, or dads can talk to their sons, or single parent to the opposite sex about puberty and sex, your choice, orgasm course or that course. Someone who signs up in the next week to our email list, as well as someone who has already been on the list, and we will announce that in next Friday's email. Okay, we have some encouragement to share with you.
Yes, and this time I get to read it.
Okay.
Because it was on my social media instead of yours.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yes. So someone found me on TikTok, and they wrote this. Your book was the catalyst to me going back in school at 30 to go into psychology so I can be a part of the solution within the church. You made me feel like I can absolutely be part of the solution for change within the church. Thank you.
That's amazing.
I know. I just thought that was so lovely.
Yeah.
Just this idea that there are people, and like we said, we've said in past podcasts too, is that this can be a very discouraging job, and it can feel like the burden is very heavy, and it feels like there's just so much to do, and there are just so many things that just keep piling up, and there's so little change or movement from those in power. And hearing that there are people who are actively working to fix it, it just makes it feel like it's not all on our shoulders.
Yeah. And I love the fact that she's gone back to school at 30.
I know. To be a licensed counselor.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we know a lot of counselors are listening to us. We're glad you're here. If you have any feedback that we can have on how we can get the Great Sex Rescue into more hands of more counselors, we would love to hear that too. So send us a note in the comment section on my blog at toLoveHonorAndVacuum.com. We will put a link to that in the podcast notes as well, wherever you listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube. Thank you for joining in, and join us next week again for another edition of the Bare Marriage Podcast. And please join me at toLoveHonorAndVacuum.com as we start our series on marriage on hard mode. Bye-bye.